Alright, a project I completed on Pyro-Tornado Genesis, or destructive fire vortices. Throughout the research process and choosing the research topic, chose a research topic mainly because of the courses I took last summer, the major electives here in the fire program, wildland fire and urban interface environment, and wildland urban interface environments in general have always interested me, and this is an interesting dynamic that truly grabbed my attention, and I wanted to research it further. An incident that occurred last year, actually in Redding, California, sparked my interest at the end of the semester after we finished learning about wildland fire and its dynamic. Redding, California was ravaged by a massive, truly massive wildfire in July of last year. It was a very interesting phenomenon that was much more dynamic in scope than a normal wildfire. Destructive fire vortices have been around for a very long time. They've been on Earth since Earth existed, of course. They're kind of a compilation of weather and fire-generated dynamics. They're described as violently rotating columns of smoke, fire, and ash that can sometimes even form their own clouds and mesoscale structures in the atmosphere. They can grow. The fire whirls can start as just a few feet off the ground, your normal fire whirls from air entrainment to a brush fire, all the way to thousands of feet to the atmosphere. There's some research has been concluded on fire vortices and destructive fire vortices. The differentiation between the two, basically one can cause severe damage to vegetation structures and be threatening to human life. The other is basically a fire whirl. Ancient cultures and many different groups of people around the world have recorded them throughout history since history began to be made on big fires. Some interesting observations from human history I'd like to mention. The first one that was well documented was the Great Kant earthquake in Tokyo, Japan in the 1920s. It occurred during a fire broke out during the lunch hour after an earthquake in Tokyo. There were many open fires. People were using fire to cook their food, and almost all the structures in Tokyo at the time were built completely of wood construction. And thatch roofs, of course. A large conflagration ensued, consuming much of the city. Multiple fires broke out, turning into a larger fire. There were many tales and records of entrainment winds sucking towards the city that were enough to sweep you off your feet, and those pulling objects, and the wind was sucking towards the fire. During the conflagration, it was reported that there were large towering smoke plumes could see hundreds of miles away almost. Groups up in the mountains so they could see it, see the fire at night like a giant glowing plume of ash and smoke. So that was one of the first well-documented firestorms where fire was truly changing dynamic into a larger event, affecting the weather of the city and entraining wind and everything like that, causing a huge plume of smoke. Second incident, better recorded, but still was kind of an interesting topic because there were people around at the time, but there still wasn't good weather measurements of what was happening. It was during World War II, during firebombing raids. The one incident that I focused on was from Hamburg, Germany, in July of 1943. There were thunderstorms already in the area. The Royal Air Force was descending on Hamburg for a night-long bombing raid. They reported thunderstorms off the coast. The air was already thick and unstable aloft, so that's going to be a very important part to what happens in these firestorms or tornadic pyro-generated storms. The Royal Air Force reportedly started bombing around 7 p.m. What happened from there, There was not many firefighting efforts, mostly in the 40s of steel wood construction, some masonry. It was burning like crazy. People were trying to get out of the city. There were very little firefighting efforts. The fire grew in size by order of magnitudes very quickly. What happened from there? Large amounts of smoke, large amounts of ash were being buoyantly thrust into the atmosphere, and through the Royal Air Force bombing, the fire grew intensely fast. So the thunderstorm's an interesting dynamic. Bombing pilots said they reportedly noticed that the thunderstorms seemed to almost entrain the air and the smoke together. So almost like they were joining forces, physical forces in the atmosphere. And this caused one of the first recollections of what is called Pyro-CB, or pyrocumulonimbus clouds, where actually the water vapor and the moisture in the atmosphere combines with ash and smoke, and when it's warmed from the fire and there's already moisture in the air, they combine to form this Pyro-CB, which I've mentioned in the paper many times. Witnesses report this Pyro-CB, the air getting entrained into the fire, kind of like what happened in Japan, fast, almost destructive entrainment winds, and then the smoke and ash rising into the sky and into clouds that had lightning like a thunderstorm, and it began to rotate. The ideas of rotation come in later, the methods and physics of how that happens, but folks did report multiple fire vortices on the ground that were destructive and did damage buildings. So next, I'd like to mention the bushfire near the capital city of Canberra, Australia. This was back in the late 2000s. It was one of the larger incidents, again, that was well documented, well researched, and actually had weather measurements and research on the actual weather conditions that led to this firestorm. To put the setting out there, temps are over 100 degrees once again in the summertime in Australia. Lightning from a thunderstorm sparked the first grass fire. It spread quickly in the grasslands and started encroaching on the foothills near Canberra. These multiple grass fires were fueled by winds from thunderstorms and other, geographical reasons. So Pyro-CB was noted to be beginning to be formed as soon as the fire began to inch towards the city into the urban environment. When the fire and smoke began to increase in size and the fire load increased, the smoke production increased. When it reached the wildland-urban interface, Pyro-CB was witnessed to be rotating almost like a mass thunderstorm. So it was one of the first well-documented DFV incidents, or pyrovortex incidents, where 160 mile per hour winds in a vortex was measured, or estimated to be 160 mile per hour, equivalent to an EF3 tornado. Lightning and smoke was reported to be rising thousands of feet into the sky, similar to what was happening in World War II. Finally, Redding, California, which I mentioned at the beginning, was the main reason I like to take upon this research. They were poised for much better measurements. This was a massive, very encompassing fire with lots of other logistical problems already with terrain, yada yada. There were lots of NEXRAD and local weather reports, good radar data, lots of fire personnel on the ground, good HD video of the event as the fire vortex formed. On July 23rd, of course, a small fire by the highway began to morph into a large conflagration that produced this vortex. Firefighting crews were plagued by erratic fire behavior. Local terrain and weather conditions began to cause issues for the firefighters on the ground. As the fire produced more and more smoke, more and more ash, the Pyro-CB began to form, and folks on the ground took note, weather officials took note. Rotation began around 7 p.m. on the 23rd and formed a destructive fire vortex on the ground for about 30 minutes. So after that, NEXRAD radar data and damage assessments confirmed there were 150 mile per hour winds on the ground for more than 30 minutes, observable pyrocumulonimbus clouds, rotation up to 18 kilometers in the atmosphere. It brought down a few high-tension power line towers, damaged and debarked many trees in the area, and it's actually scoured the ground a few inches deep where the vortex was at its high strength. Next, I wanted to dive into, what makes these things click. Tornadoes obviously have interested me for various reasons, but fire and tornadoes together are just almost witchcraft. As far as meteorology goes, destructive fire vortices are an interesting combination of a few ingredients that I discovered were very important to creation of large firestorms. In San Jose, California, California State University, in conjunction with National Science Foundation, actually studied components that led to large fires creating their own weather and their own entrainment winds and how they affect the large-scale fire scene. So they used Doppler LiDAR, which is laser radar, for close-range measurements on fire plumes and fire entrainment winds. They published a document called The Mean and Turbulent Properties of Wildfire and Convective Plume. They discovered that the convective plume, after they architecturally analyzed it and scanned it, and found that updrafts and temperature layers were present all the way up through the entire smoke plume, and that only 4 to 12% of smoke plumes in large-scale fires would ever reach the point to where mesoscale, or at a global scale, the entire plume would begin to rotate and pyrocumulonimbus clouds would actually form and begin to function like a thunderstorm in the upper atmosphere. It's very interesting that they found that injecting smoke and temperature gradients puncturing through the atmosphere are very critical to formation of destructive fire vortices on the ground. So strong radial convergence coming in from ground wind patterns as well as terrain effects on the wind can cause smaller fire whirls, but large pyro-tornadoes like what happens in Redding, California, are massively reliant on weather boundaries up in upper atmosphere and upper atmosphere boundaries. So what's extremely important is that the vertical puncturing of layers of the atmosphere, if there's cool air above or warm air below or vice versa, depending on the stretching of atmospheric boundaries and updrafts can begin to form. This is what we know known as helicity or vorticity, when two boundaries are moving in conjunction with one another in a way that cause horizontal rolling in the atmosphere. The plume of the smoke can actually entrain that vortex and begin to cause the entire plume to rotate. It's very interesting that synoptic mesoscale weather analysis for these fire tornado or pyro-tornadoes is extremely similar to supercellular thunderstorm tornadoes. Terrain, heat release rates, cyclonic wind shear, like I said, between the boundary layers of the atmosphere, all play into the formation of the fire vortex. Different locations and environments are more at risk for these type of events. The way the wind's blowing and the terrain can actually exemplify how and steer the smoke in a direction depending on entrainment rate. One entrainment wind coming down a perfect valley could start the rotation before the atmosphere does or the boundary level does. So it's found that in rapid progression of fires, the surface level vorticity is obviously the main factor. The main thing I wanted to touch on was what for emergency personnel do we need to be looking for? Do weather forecasters and emergency managers need to be looking for vorticity in the atmosphere, frontal boundaries near the fire, and terrain, or what should we focus on? So I found that the main thing that I think is important for the fire service to focus on for destructive fire vortices is to not discount their seriousness. Folks think that it's some crazy occurrence that's very unlikely. So I believe that it's very important that to know that they can have devastating effects on life and property, and they need to be taken seriously. Weather crews are now beginning to get better and better on predicting destructive fire vortices and tornadoes alike because they share some of the same properties. but triaging and managing large-scale incidents should be treated like tornadoes. Logistics and evacuations and sheltering need to be treated like tornadoes. The likelihood is very low that they will ever affect a direct fire line crew, but we should have plans and incident response guidelines for destructive fire vortices. Identifying their primary factors that could cause them to form in the atmosphere, direct indicators that one is forming, and weather radar data is very important to get to emergency management and firefighter crews to keep them safe. So in conclusion, scientific analysis has found that they're very unlikely, but they can happen and they can be very deadly and devastating. So taking them serious is a very important role that emergency managers must take. Next, weather forecasters still have a lot to learn. So there's still a lot of information out there that is yet to be found. We must continue to research these. With the threat of global warming and climate change, big fires are on the rise, and the weather and the climate is changing. So they could be becoming more prevalent. Forecasters should aim with prosperity to reduce life and property, just like emergency managers and all the others. Raising awareness, of course. Sheltering and evacuations during fire events may need to be altered. So that's pretty much all I have. That concludes my project on destructive fire vortices.